Welcome, my friends, to a new book. And today, of course, we're looking at the book of Romans, which has so much rich theology in it. Now, Paul did not start the Church of Rome, nor did any of the other 11 apostles. As you know, Rome was the center of the ancient world. Perhaps you've heard the phrase, all roads lead to Rome. So we can assume that the Roman church was planted soon after the day of Pentecost by Jews from Rome who'd visited Jerusalem for the Pentecost festival and then been converted. But Paul himself had never even visited Rome. And so this letter is an introduction of Paul's teaching to the Roman church. And so it reads more like a theological treatise than a personal letter. Now, this first chapter is breathtaking in its scope and razor sharp in its analysis of humanity. And I think that the key verse in understanding this chapter is the 5th verse, where Paul states his commission from God. Paul says, through whom we have received grace and apostleship, now get this, to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake. Now, Paul's purpose is to bring people to the, quote, obedience of faith. In other words, to place your faith in Jesus is to obey God. To not believe is to disobey God. Now, you don't often hear people speak in these terms. In Acts 17:30, in Paul's famous speech in Athens, he said this, therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring that all people everywhere should repent. And the King James translates it even stronger. It says, God now commands all men everywhere to repent. Now, most people think of faith as a mere choice. Everyone is free to choose however they want, and all choices are equally valid. But we read here that failing to embrace Christ is disobeying God, and that there is a price to pay for doing so, and that price, as we shall see, is the wrath of God. Now, this seems harsh to many, because it's common to think that the reason why otherwise good people reject faith in God and Jesus Christ is because the evidence for God and the gospel is not compelling, that it's ambiguous. But that is not the case. And we read in verse 20 that the evidence for God and the gospel is so compelling that those who fail to believe are, and I quote, without excuse. Now, first we have the evidence from nature, which is clear and convincing. Let me read verse 20. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what he has made, so they are without excuse. Now, when we look at the existence of the world, it clearly witnesses to a powerful creator. And when we note the incredible complexity of its design, it tells us that this creator is incredibly wise. In fact, the more we're able to study this creation, the greater is the evidence for the incredible complexity of design. Psalm 19, verses 1 through 2 says this, the heavens are declaring the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Day to day pours forth speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. And now, beyond nature, our Creator has also put the knowledge of himself in every human heart. Let me read verse 19. Because that which is known about God is evident within them, for God made it evident to them. Do you know there's never been a human society that was not religious? Even here in America, with so many champions of atheism and secularism in our schools and universities, the most recent Gallup poll, in that one, 87% answered yes to the question, do you believe in God? The existence of God is simply self-evident. Now, another powerful witness is the resurrection of Jesus, which is an historically verifiable event if we just use the normal rules of historical study. Verse 4, we read this. Jesus was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. Jesus' resurrection is a powerful witness to the truth. In addition, God also bears powerful witness in the human heart. Verse 16 says that the gospel is the power of God for salvation for anyone. You see, the gospel message comes with divine power. If people are willing to honestly seek for God, He will bear witness to the gospel in their own heart. And this power changes lives, and then these changed lives bear further witness to the gospel's power. And so opposition to God's command to believe the gospel is not due to a lack of evidence, but rather it is a choice to suppress the truth for wicked reasons. This then brings God's judgment. Verse 18. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of those who, quote, suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Now, God's wrath, what is that? Well, it's His active opposition to ungodliness and unrighteousness. God's wrath includes removing His grace and protection, get that, and giving people and societies over to the destruction of their lusts and their deceptions. You know, 3 times in this chapter we read the words, and God gave them over, and God gave them over, and God gave them over. And there's a downward progression in this process. It begins with the failure to acknowledge God and honor Him, which leads to a breakdown in our thinking. Verse 21. For even though they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks, but they became futile or empty in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. And professing to be wise, they became fools. Now, this choice leads to God giving them over. Verse 24. Therefore, God gave them over in the lust of their hearts to impurity, so that their bodies would be dishonored among them. So God gives them over to impurity so that they are ruled by the power of their self-destructive lusts. Well, the next step down is to go from bondage of natural lusts or bondage to natural lusts to bondage to unnatural lusts. Verse 26 and 27. For this reason, God gave them over to degrading passions. For their women exchanged the natural function for that which is unnatural. And in the same way also men abandon the natural function of women and burn in their desire towards one another. Now, the widespread practice and approval of homosexuality is a sign that a culture has gone far down the road of degradation and delusion. Until finally you reach the third stage, the third giving over, verse 28. And just as they did not see fit to acknowledge God any longer, God gave them over to a depraved mind to do things which are not proper. Now, a depraved mind is one that is no longer moderated by any reverence or fear of God. And so there's nothing left to turn their thinking away from complete deception and self-destruction. Now, verses 29 through 31 catalog what a society is like that has reached such a state. It is full of hate, wickedness, murder, treachery, and rebellion. And it is lacking in love, mercy, and trust. And as the final verse in this chapter notes, that people who do such things, such wickedness, they not only do it, but they celebrate and encourage others to do the same. Now, this chapter reminds us of how desperately individuals and whole societies need the influences of God and how awful it is to turn our backs on Him. You know, the worst place that can be imagined is where? It's hell. And hell is above everything else a place without the presence or influence of God. Do you know that the 2 most horrible and frightening words in the English language are God forsaken? Well, the first several chapters of Romans lay out the bad news about the world. But the glorious good news of the gospel, which will make up the bulk of the letter, is foreshadowed in this chapter in verse 16, where we read, For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Let's continue to look to God. Let's believe that our society can turn around, and let's put our faith in the power of the gospel.